The morning I made the decision that would change everything, the sky above the village of Ashford looked the color of old pewter, heavy, waterlogged, pressing down on the thatched rooftops like a hand refusing to lift. I remember the smell of it. Rain-soaked earth and wood smoke and something else beneath it all, something sharp and metallic that the older villagers said meant the high wolves were near. I hadn't believed them then. I had been too busy surviving. My name is Lottie. Not Charlotte, not Lady Charlotte, not anything that carried the weight of silk and silver. Just Lottie, the healer's daughter, the girl who mixed poultices before she could read runes, who knew the name of every herb in the valley, but not the name of anyone at the king's court. That morning, I was carrying 2 clay pots of willow bark tincture to old Marin's cottage at the edge of the market when the crowd shifted. That is the only way I can describe it. The way a crowd shifts when something passes through it, the way people step sideways without deciding to, the way heads turn and eyes drop and voices go quiet all at once. I stopped walking. One of the clay pots was warm against my arm. Through the gap in the bodies, I saw them first as shapes, dark shapes, moving with an authority that the muddy road of Ashford seemed entirely unprepared for. 6 men on horseback, cloaked in deep charcoal and forest green, their horses enormous animals that snorted white breath into the cold air. Royal colors, though worn plainly enough that a person could almost mistake them for a merchant's guard. Almost. I watched one rider at the center of the group. He wore no crown, no sigil pinned to his chest, nothing that announced him. His cloak was plain, his horse was not. A black animal with a high neck and quiet eyes that seemed to notice everything, the way its rider seemed to notice everything. The man himself was broad-shouldered, dark-haired, perhaps a decade older than me. His jaw was set in the particular way of someone accustomed to being obeyed without asking. I looked away quickly. Not from fear exactly, from the feeling that looking too long at something like that would cost you something you weren't prepared to give. The riders stopped near the well at the center of the square. One of the lesser riders called out, something about requiring grain stores to be tallied for the crown's winter count. The usual bureaucratic business that rolled through villages like ours every few months, leaving behind a faint taste of resentment and a tally sheet. I had no grain to tally. I kept moving. I was 3 steps past the well when I heard it. A sharp crack, and then the particular heavy sound of something falling, and then a man's voice. A low sound, not a cry, but the kind of sound that is kept very short and controlled because the person making it refuses to let it become anything more. I turned around. The central rider, the broad-shouldered one, was on the ground. His horse had shied at something, a loose dog that had bolted across the square, and the man had come down hard on his left side, catching the edge of the stone well on his way. He was already pushing himself upright, which told me the landing had been humiliating more than anything else, but when he put weight on his left leg, he stopped moving. His face did something complicated and brief. He controlled it immediately. His companions had moved their horses in a tight cluster around him, and a murmuring had begun in the crowd, excited, uncertain, a little predatory in the way crowds always become when the powerful are momentarily reduced. I don't know what made me move. I had been told often enough to keep my eyes down around King's men, to stay small, to stay invisible. My mother had said it gently. The village elder had said it less gently. Every lesson I'd ever absorbed said, "Not your problem, not your place, keep walking." Instead, I set down my clay pots on the wall of the nearest doorstep, wiped my hands on the rough cloth of my apron, and walked toward him. His companions saw me first. One of them, a lean man with sand-colored hair and watchful eyes, moved his horse slightly, not quite blocking me but making clear he was considering it. "Stand away," he said, not unkindly, just flatly. "I'm a healer," I said, which was mostly true. I was a healer's daughter who had been doing a healer's work since my mother's hands had begun to shake 3 winters ago. His ankle or his knee? A pause. The lean rider looked at the man on the ground. The dark-haired man had risen fully now, standing with his weight shifted, his expression entirely unreadable. He studied me for a moment in the way that people rarely study someone like me, carefully, without dismissal. Then he said, with a voice that was quieter than I expected and carried further than it should have, "Ankle. Then I can help if you'll allow it." Another pause. Longer. The crowd was very still. "I am no one of consequence," the dark-haired man said slowly, as though testing the words. "Only a servant of the crown on a counting errand, hardly worth a healer's attention." Something about the way he said it didn't fit. Servants of the crown didn't speak in that register. They didn't hold their shoulders like that. And the lean rider with the sand-colored hair had looked at him very quickly, with an expression that came and went so fast I almost missed it. The particular expression of someone suppressing the urge to correct something. But I was already kneeling beside the well with my gathering pouch open, and I had decided to take the man at his word because it was the only polite thing to do. "Then you'll appreciate practical help," I said, pulling out the tight-rolled linen strips and the small jar of comfrey compress I carried on every errand. "What is your name?" He looked down at me with an expression I couldn't fully name. Watchful. Something underneath the watchfulness that I didn't have a word for yet. "Darius," he said. I nodded as though that was entirely ordinary, which of course it was not. Darius was the name of the AlphaKing, had been the name on every royal decree for 9 years, a name that village children said in whispers, and village elders said with careful deference. But this man's cloak was plain, and his hands were calloused, and he had told me he was no one of consequence, and so I chose to believe him. Because that is what you do when someone offers you a version of themselves, and asks you not to push on it. You take the version they've offered. I unrolled the linen, unstopped the comfrey jar, and began to work. He didn't flinch, which told me a great deal. He watched my hands rather than my face, which told me something else. The ankle was swollen along the outer edge, a lateral strain, not a break, which was lucky. And I worked efficiently and in silence, while the crowd slowly, reluctantly, dispersed around us. "You're not afraid of me," he said. Not a question. I pressed a fold of linen into place and looked up briefly. His eyes were very dark, the color of deep water in autumn, watching me with that careful, unreadable attention. "I've never found fear to be particularly useful in the treatment of injuries," I said, and looked back down at my work. The lean rider made a very small sound. I chose not to identify what kind. "And if I were dangerous?" Darius said. "Then I would still be finishing this binding," I said, "because a swollen ankle is a swollen ankle, regardless of the character of the person attached to it." A silence. And then, quietly, something happened to his expression that I felt rather than saw. A shift, slight and brief, like a door opening by an inch in a room you thought was sealed. "Your name," he said. "Lottie." "Just Lottie?" "It's been sufficient so far." He was quiet for a moment. Above us, the pewter sky had begun to release a thin, cold rain, and the smell of wood smoke deepened. And somewhere across the square, one of my clay pots was getting wet, and I had old Marin waiting, and none of that felt particularly urgent anymore. "Thank you," said the man who had called himself a servant of no consequence, in a voice that carried the weight of something much larger than a counting errand. I rose, gathered my linen strips, and looked at him, directly, which I knew I shouldn't, and for a breath longer than was polite. "Rest it tonight," I said. "Elevate if you can. Don't ride hard on it tomorrow. And if I don't follow your instructions?" "Then it will hurt considerably more," I said plainly, "and you'll deserve it." The lean rider made the same small sound. This time I was almost certain it was something close to a laugh. I retrieved my clay pots from the doorstep, tucked them back under my arm, and walked away through the thinning rain without looking back. But I felt, with the particular certainty of something already decided, that I had just made a mistake I would spend a long time being grateful for. 3 days passed before I allowed myself to think about him again. That is not entirely true. I thought about him constantly. In the quiet moments between grinding dried lavender and measuring out fever drops, in the long silences of my mother's cottage when she slept, and I sat by the fire with nothing but the sound of wind against the shutters. I thought about the way he had said thank you, as though the word cost him something real. I thought about the small shift in his expression, that brief opening of something sealed. But I did not allow myself to think about what he was. Old Marin had been the one to tell me, the afternoon of the day it happened, when I had finally delivered the tincture 2 hours late and rain-cold and out of breath. She had looked at me with her ancient, complicated eyes and said, without preamble, "You bound the ankle of the AlphaKing this morning." I had set down the clay pot very carefully. "He said he was a servant of the crown." "He says many things," old Marin had replied, "when he wants to know what is true." I had walked home in the rain with that knowledge and done nothing useful with it for 3 days. On the 4th morning, the summons came. It arrived in the hands of a young page, a boy of perhaps 12, solemn-faced and damp-eared, who knocked on our cottage door at the hour when the village was barely stirring. He carried a folded square of heavy parchment sealed with dark wax, and the impression of a sigil I recognized from the tax collection notices that were nailed to the market post twice yearly. My mother was still sleeping. I took the parchment outside, stood in the gray early light, and broke the seal. The letter was brief. It requested, which meant required, the presence of the healer called Lottie of Ashford at the castle of Thornwall by the 3rd day of the following week, in the capacity of consultation regarding the ongoing treatment of an ankle injury sustained by a member of the Crown's traveling party. Member of the Crown's traveling party. I read it twice. Then I folded it very precisely and put it in my apron pocket and went inside to start the morning fire, because some things are too large to react to before breakfast. Thornwall Castle sat 3 hours east of Ashford, visible on clear days as a dark interruption of the horizon, a shape that the land around it seemed to organize itself toward and away from simultaneously. I had seen it from the top of Crest Hill my whole life, and thought about it the way most people think about distant things, as belonging to a different layer of existence than the one they moved through. I arrived on horseback, borrowed, a mild-tempered brown mare who belonged to the miller's brother, and who had been offered without much explanation beyond the news that I had received a royal summons, which seemed to render all other details irrelevant. The gate guards passed me through after a brief searching look at the letter. A steward met me in the outer courtyard and led me through corridors of stone that smelled of torch smoke and dried herbs, and the particular mineral dampness of very old walls. The room I was brought to was not a throne room or a great hall. It was something more like a study, smaller than I had imagined, lined with bookshelves and a long table covered in maps and parchment, lit by 3 windows that looked out over an inner courtyard, where someone had planted herbs in raised stone beds. The sight of them, ordinary rosemary and sage and what looked like comfrey growing in organized rows, was so unexpected that I almost laughed. Almost. Darius was standing at the center window with his back to me when I entered, and there was no plain gray cloak now, no pretense of a counting errand. He wore the dark colors of his house, deep forest green and charcoal. And there were no heavy jewels or ostentatious displays, but there was something about the way he stood in that room, the way the room organized itself around him, that made the absence of a crown almost beside the point. The lean rider, whose name I had since learned from the page was Cade, the king's first gamma and closest advisor, stood near the door. He looked at me with the expression of a man who found the entire situation quietly satisfying and was choosing not to show it very well. Darius turned. He looked at me in exactly the same way he had looked at me in the market square, which was to say, carefully, without dismissal, with that watchful quality that made you feel examined without feeling diminished. "Lottie of Ashford," he said. "Your Majesty," I said, and did a passable curtsy that my mother would have approved of, and that probably fell short of what a court would have expected. I straightened and looked at him directly because I didn't know how else to behave. "How is the ankle?" Cade made a small sound. Something moved at the edge of Darius's expression, very brief. "Improved," he said. "Your instructions were followed. I'm glad to hear it. Did you elevate it?" A pause. "For a portion of the night. A portion. Ruling a kingdom generates correspondence that does not pause for ankle injuries." "I imagine it does," I said, and I was surprised to find that I was not afraid. I should have been. This was the Alpha King, the most powerful individual in 7 territories. A man who commanded armies and settled disputes between noble houses and whose judgment was, by common understanding, final and absolute. I was a village healer's daughter, in a rough linen apron with ink stains on my left hand and road dust on my boots. And yet, there was something in the plainness of this room, in the herbs in the courtyard below, in the way he stood, not performing power, just inhabiting it, that made the ground between us feel less impossible than it should. "I asked you here," Darius said, "because I require the services of a skilled healer at Thornwall for the winter months. Our court physician is elderly and manages chronic illness well, but has less experience with field injuries and the particular demands of—" he paused briefly, "a household like this one." "You have warriors," I said, "many, and they are frequently injured. And they are collectively difficult patients." Cade coughed. "I am not a court healer," I said carefully. "I am a village healer's daughter who has been practicing in her mother's absence. I don't know court protocol, or noble politics, or the particular languages people here use to say things they don't mean." "I'm aware," Darius said. "Those are not the qualities I'm hiring for." I looked at him. He looked at me. "What qualities are you hiring for?" I asked. He was quiet for a moment, and the quality of the silence was different from what I expected. Not strategic, not calculated. Considered. As though he were choosing honesty over the easier, more polished answer. "Someone who will look at the situation in front of them and respond to it as it actually is," he said, "rather than as they have been told to see it." I thought about the market square, about choosing to believe a king who called himself a servant because he had offered that version and asked not to be pushed on it, about the clay pots getting wet on the doorstep in the pewter sky and the way I had kept working because a swollen ankle was a swollen ankle regardless. "My mother needs checking on," I said. "A rider will visit Ashford every week," Darius said immediately, as though this had already been arranged. "If your mother requires anything, a physician, provisions, firewood, it will be provided." That was the moment I understood that this decision had, in some important way, already been made. Not by him dictating it, but by the fact that I had knelt in the mud of a market square 4 days ago and wrapped a king's ankle without caring who he was. And something in that act had set something else in motion that I was only now beginning to see the shape of. I looked once more at the herb garden through the window. Rosemary, sage, comfrey. Someone knew what they were doing with that soil. "Who tends the garden?" I asked. A flicker, almost imperceptible. "I do," Darius said. "When time permits." Something settled in me then. Some internal arrangement of wariness and wonder that shifted into something quieter and more resolved. "Then I imagine we'll find common ground," I said. Cade, near the door, was smiling at the floor. The weeks that followed were nothing like I had prepared for, and everything like I had feared, in the best and worst senses simultaneously. Thornwall was not the cold, hard place I had imagined from the outside. It was busy, relentlessly, startlingly busy, with the particular energy of a household where the Lord took the work of leadership seriously and expected the same from everyone around him. Cade managed the political correspondence and the guard rotations with a quiet efficiency that never quite masked how much he was watching everything. The head housekeeper, a compact, sharp-faced woman named Brita, ruled the domestic arrangements of the castle with absolute authority and a voice that carried through stone walls. The castle smith, a mountain of a man called Oswin, had a laugh you could hear from 3 courtyards away, and a habit of injuring himself creatively, and then presenting his wounds to me with the cheerful pride of someone showing off an accomplishment. There were 12 warriors in regular rotation, betas, mostly, with 2 gammas who served as unit leaders, and they were indeed difficult patients. Not malicious. Simply constitutionally opposed to the concept of rest, and united in the belief that an injury that didn't prevent you from lifting a sword probably didn't count as an injury. I learned them, one by one, the way I had always learned the people I cared for, by watching, by asking small questions at careful moments, by noticing what they didn't say as much as what they did. Theron, the elder of the 2 Gamma unit leaders, was the worst patient of all of them. A scarred, barrel-chested man of 40 who treated my instructions as suggestions. His younger colleague Petra, the first female Gamma warrior I had ever met, and one of the few people in the castle who looked at me from the first day without any particular suspicion, took her injuries seriously and asked intelligent questions, and occasionally told me what Theron was hiding. I was grateful for Petra immediately. I saw Darius every day, because the castle was not large enough to avoid anyone completely, and because a healer's duties were broad enough to take me through every part of it. But our interactions were, at first, brief and practical. A hallway exchange about whether a certain warrior's rib needed strapping. A question at the herb garden about the Comfrey's winter progress. A sentence or 2 passed in the corridor outside the evening meal. Each one left me with the feeling of a conversation that had not yet finished. It was Cade who told me, at the end of my 2nd week, while I was cataloging the herb stores in the castle's still room. He tested 4 healers before you. They all saw the crown before they saw the man. I didn't look up from the dried thyme I was sorting. And what did I see? I asked. An ankle, Cade said simply. I thought about that for a long time after he left. Winter came to Thornwall the way it came to all high places, without apology. One morning the courtyard herb garden was frost-touched but alive, its rosemary still holding the silver-gray color of something that intended to survive. 3 days later, a hard freeze descended from the northern pass, and the world outside the castle walls turned the color of bone and iron. The warriors adjusted their training to the inner yard. The fires in the great hall burned through the night, and the particular closeness that cold weather forces on people who share walls began to press everyone into each other's company in ways that comfort and ease never would have managed. I had been at Thornwall for 5 weeks. In that time, I had set 2 cracked ribs, treated a rope burn that Oswin insisted hadn't happened by way of his own carelessness despite all evidence to the contrary, managed a fever that had moved through 4 of the younger guards in quick succession, and spent a full afternoon removing a splinter from Theron's palm that he had spent 3 days pretending wasn't there. You should have come to me on the first day, I told him, as he sat with the particular rigid posture of a man determined not to look bothered by something that was obviously bothering him. It was a small matter, he said. It was infected, I said, mildly. Theron. I looked up at him. He was looking at the wall with the focused attention of someone examining architecture he found deeply interesting. If it had been left another day, you would have lost the use of the hand for a week. You're a Gamma warrior. Your unit depends on your hands. A pause. Something shifted in his expression. Not shame, exactly. Something more complicated. The awareness of having let pride override the responsibility he carried toward others. I will be more prompt, he said stiffly. I'm not asking for gratitude, I said, going back to work. I'm asking you to treat your body as something that belongs to the people who rely on you, not just to yourself." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Where did you learn to talk to warriors like that?" "I learned to talk to people like that," I said. "Warriors are people." He looked at me then. A long, assessing look, the kind that takes stock rather than dismisses. Then he nodded once, with the deliberate weight of someone deciding something. After that, Theron came to me promptly. It was Petra who brought me into the difficulty with Lady Seraphine. Seraphine arrived at Thornwall on a blustery afternoon in the 6th week of my stay, a noblewoman from the Western Territories, tall and polished and beautiful in the way of things that have been very carefully maintained. She came with a retinue of 4 attendants and a letter from her father, a powerful border lord, and the particular air of a woman who had decided what she intended to accomplish and considered all obstacles merely logistical. She had come, it was understood by everyone, except possibly no one, in pursuit of the AlphaKing's consideration as a potential queen. Cade told me this with the careful neutrality of a man presenting information he expected me to find relevant. I received it with the careful neutrality of a woman determined to find it irrelevant. "The king receives many such visits," Cade added, which I had not asked about. "I imagine he does," I said, and went back to grinding the dried elderberry I was working on. Cade left. I ground elderberry until the bowl was full, and then I ground a little more. Seraphine noticed me at dinner the 2nd evening of her visit, in the way that certain people notice those they consider minor. Quickly, thoroughly, and with a classification that happens in the space of a single glance. I was seated at the lower end of the Great Hall's long table, between Petra and Oswin, which was where I had eaten every evening and where I was comfortable, which perhaps was itself a kind of evidence about something. Seraphine sat near the king's end of the table, and spoke beautifully, and laughed at the right moments, and was, I could observe from a distance, genuinely charming when she chose to be. She also had sharp eyes that moved around the room with a cataloging intelligence she mostly concealed behind a pleasant expression. She catalogued me somewhere around the soup course and then moved on, which I expected. What I did not expect was the conversation in the still room the following morning. I was measuring out fever-reducing compounds, a precaution with the cold deepening, when the door opened and Seraphine came in, alone, without the attendants, which was surprising enough that I forgot to say anything polite before I said anything at all. "This is the healer's workroom," I said. "I know what it is," she said pleasantly, coming to stand on the other side of the work table with the comfort of someone accustomed to entering rooms and immediately owning them. She looked at the dried herbs hung from the low beams, at the rows of small clay jars, at my hands and my apron, and my general appearance with that quick, thorough attention. "You're Lottie." "Yes." "The king speaks of you," she said, practically, with respect. A brief pause. "He doesn't speak of many people that way." I said nothing, because I didn't know what was being offered or requested, and I had learned that silence was frequently more useful than filling space. "I want you to understand," Seraphine said, and her voice was still pleasant, but something in it had sharpened slightly, "that I am not a fool, and I am not cruel. I'm simply practical. My father has made an arrangement. I intend to honor it, and I would prefer that everything around me, every element of the environment I'm moving into, be aligned with that." I looked at her. She looked back steadily. "I am a healer," I said carefully. "I don't align or misalign with anyone's arrangements. I treat injuries and manage illness. That's the full scope of my presence here." Something moved through her eyes. Not quite belief. Not quite disbelief. "Of course," she said, equally carefully. She left. I stood in the still room for a long moment with the elderberry compound in my hands, and the cold feeling of a line having been drawn somewhere I hadn't been paying close enough attention to. That evening, I went to the herb garden. It was a strange thing to do in the dark and the cold, and I knew it. And I went anyway because the herb garden had become the place I went when I needed to think. The rosemary was still alive under its layer of straw mulch, which seemed like a small but significant fact. I crouched beside the raised beds and pulled a dead leaf from the sage and told myself I was checking on the plants and not simply standing in a place where I felt less uncertain about everything. You should wear a heavier cloak. I turned. Darius stood at the garden entrance. No ceremony, no escort, just himself in his house colors with his breath fogging in the cold air. He looked at me the same way he always looked at me, which was to say entirely, and without the filter of anything I was supposed to be. I didn't hear you approach, I said, which was true and also somewhat accusatory. High wolves are quiet, he said, with a tone so flat and simple that I couldn't tell if he was being wry or simply factual. He came to stand beside the herb beds, not too close, and looked down at the mulched rows with an expression I recognized from the moments when he thought no one was watching him. Open, in the way that a face is open when it isn't performing anything. The comfrey will come back in spring, I said, because I needed to say something, and that was true. It always does, he said. It's stubborn. I respect that in a plant. I looked at the rosemary. He looked at the rosemary. The cold pressed down around us with the particular intimacy of shared discomfort. Lady Seraphine came to see me this morning, I said. A pause. I know, he said. Of course he did. This was his castle, and Cade missed nothing. She was not unkind, I said, which was true, if incomplete. No, Darius said. She is rarely unkind. She's intelligent enough to know that cruelty is inefficient. He said it without edge, simply observing. My council has been recommending the arrangement for 2 years. A border alliance. Political stability, practical considerations. Those are real things, I said. They are, he agreed. We stood in the cold and neither of us said what was underneath any of that, because some things exist most fully in the moment before they are named. I felt his attention move to me, slow and deliberate. Why did you come to the garden tonight? He asked. I thought about Seraphine's careful, pleasant face, and the line she had drawn. I thought about Cade saying they all saw the crown before they saw the man. I thought about the weight of being in a place where every choice carried consequences that ramified outward in directions I couldn't fully see. Because it's the truest place in the castle, I said finally. Nothing here is performing anything. It's just growing or not growing. A silence. Long enough that I thought I had said too much. Then Darius said very quietly, Yes, that is exactly why I built it. I turned to look at him. He was already looking at me. In the dark and the cold, with the frost-silver rosemary between us and the whole enormous weight of what he was and what I wasn't pressing down from every direction, something passed between us that I couldn't name and didn't try to. I looked away first, but only barely. You should go inside, he said. You'll be useless as a healer if you freeze in the garden. That is the least romantic thing anyone has ever said to me, I said, which I had not planned to say, and which surprised both of us. Darius was quiet for a moment. Then he said, in the same quiet, unguarded voice, I know very little about romance. I know considerably more about practicality. I've noticed, I said. Is that a complaint? I pulled my cloak tighter and turned toward the castle door. Ask me in spring, I said, when the comfrey comes back. I didn't see his expression, but as I crossed the courtyard toward the warm light of the doorway, I heard nothing behind me for a long moment, and then the quiet sound of someone remaining in a cold garden longer than was sensible, which told me everything I needed and nothing I knew how to hold yet. The trouble arrived, as trouble often does, wearing the face of something reasonable. It came in the form of Lord Aldrich of the Eastern Reach, Seraphine's father, who rode into Thornwall's courtyard on a Tuesday morning with twice the retinue anyone had been expecting, and a manner that suggested he considered the visit less a courtesy call and more an inspection. He was a large man gone soft at the edges, in the way of men who were once warriors and have since found power more efficient than physical force. His eyes were Seraphine's eyes, quick, cataloging, but without her discipline over what they revealed. He looked at Thornwall's walls and found them adequate. He looked at Darius and found something he was calculating. He looked at me, passing through the courtyard with a basket of medicines for the morning rounds, and found something he immediately filed under irrelevant, which I recognized as a kind of safety. It did not last. The first council dinner was the evening of Aldrich's arrival, a formal meal in the great hall with the castle's senior household present, which included Cade and Theron and Petra as ranking fighters, Brita as head of the domestic staff, and myself in the peculiar position of castle healer, which carried no formal rank but had accumulated, over 7 weeks, a quiet kind of authority that I had not sought and was only beginning to understand. I wore the best dress I had brought from Ashford, which was a deep blue wool that my mother had made 2 winters ago, and which was warm and well cut and entirely wrong for a formal dinner at a royal castle. Petra had offered me something from the castle stores. We keep formal garments for visiting dignitaries. There are smaller sizes. And I had declined, because wearing borrowed clothes to a dinner where I already felt borrowed felt like compounding a problem. I sat at the lower portion of the table and watched. Aldrich spent the first course establishing the terms of the alliance in the casual, sideways manner of someone who considers the conclusion already reached and is simply enjoying the process of arriving there formally. He spoke about border stability and trade agreements and the particular vulnerabilities of the Northern Pass in winter, all of which were real concerns, and all of which existed inside a frame that assumed a specific answer to a question no one had technically asked yet. Darius listened. He was very good at listening in the way that revealed nothing, present, engaged, giving nothing away. Cade sat 2 seats to his right, and was so still he was nearly invisible, which I had learned was Cade's way of paying the most intense possible attention. Seraphine sat between her father and Darius, and was gracious and measured and said nothing that could be used against her. She caught my eye once, across the length of the table, and something in her expression was less the pleasant composure of the first days, and more the particular weariness of someone who is also watching and also cataloging, and perhaps not entirely satisfied with what they see in their own situation. I thought about that look for the rest of the meal. The crisis happened on the 3rd day of Aldrich's visit. It began, as many crises at Thornwall began, with Oswin. The smith had been repairing the fitting on a forge bellows, a task he had described to me the day before with the infectious enthusiasm he brought to all mechanical problems. When something had gone wrong with the iron brace he was repositioning, I heard about it secondhand from a young guard who came to the still room at a near run, slightly white around the eyes, saying that Oswin had been hurt, and it was... He paused here, visibly selecting his words. Significant. Oswin's left forearm had taken a blow from the iron brace when it slipped. Not a break. The bone held, but a deep impact bruise with some tearing of the muscle beneath, and the kind of pain that a man of Oswin's constitution, who laughed at everything, was not laughing at. I was at the forge within minutes, and the next hour was work. Real work. The kind that narrowed the world to the problem in front of you and pushed everything peripheral to the edges. Cleaning the wound where the skin had broken, assessing the muscle damage, applying a deep compress of arnica and comfrey, strapping the arm correctly, telling Oswin, twice, that no, he could not return to the forge tomorrow, and watching his face cycle through grief and protest and reluctant acceptance. "Who will manage the winter repairs?" he said. "Your apprentice is competent," I said. "You've said so yourself." "He's competent when I'm watching him." "Then watch him from a chair," I said. "You have 2 eyes and a voice. Use those." He looked at me with the expression of a man who is simultaneously annoyed and knows he has no argument. "You are very difficult to be injured around," he said. "You are very difficult to injure," I said, which made him laugh despite himself. And the laugh made the forearm hurt, and that made him stop, which was probably for the best. I was packing my supplies to leave when I became aware that we were not alone. Aldrich stood in the doorway of the forge. Behind him, at a slight distance that suggested he had arrived of his own accord, rather than at Aldrich's invitation, was Darius. Aldrich was watching me with the look of someone revising a classification. "This is the village girl," he said. Not to Darius, not to me. Simply an observation directed at the air. "This is the castle healer," Darius said, in the same even tone. "Quiet, carrying." Aldrich smiled. It was a practiced smile, the kind that was technically warm. Of course. I'd heard she was skilled. He looked at Oswin's strapped arm, at the organized supplies I was repacking, at the economy of the setup. The small space used well, nothing wasted. Remarkable, for someone without formal training. "Effective," I said pleasantly, "is what I'd aim for." Aldrich's eyes moved to me with sudden full attention. He was recalibrating again. I could see it happening. The small adjustment of someone who had expected a village girl and received something that didn't quite fit the category. "Indeed," he said. Then, with the ease of a man who considers casual power a form of courtesy, "It must be gratifying. To be brought in from Ashford, was it? To serve at a royal court. Quite an elevation for a girl of your origins." The forge was quiet. Oswin had gone very still, which for Oswin was itself a signal. I looked at Aldrich. I thought about what I knew of men like him, men who wrapped condescension in civility and called it generosity, who used gratitude as a form of sealing. "I was invited," I said, "because I was needed. I stay because the work is real. The elevation, as you call it, is a detail. A beat." Aldrich's smile held, but something behind it tightened. "Quite right," he said, in the tone of a man closing a subject. Darius said nothing. But as Aldrich turned back toward the door and began some remark about the forge layout, I felt Darius's attention on me with the particular quality it had in the herb garden. Full, present, without performance. I did not look at him. I picked up my supply basket and said my goodbyes to Oswin and walked out, and if my hands were shaking slightly as I crossed the courtyard, the cold morning air was a convenient explanation. That afternoon, Cade found me in the still room. He came in without ceremony and sat on the stool near the window and was quiet for a moment, in the way of someone arranging something they want to say correctly. "Lord Aldrich leaves in 2 days," he said. "I know," I said. "Before he goes, he will formally request the king's answer regarding Lady Seraphine." I said nothing. I was measuring dried chamomile with more precision than the task required. "The council supports the arrangement," Cade continued. "It is a sound alliance. There are genuine political reasons for it." A pause. "There are also things that political reasons cannot account for." "Cade," I said quietly. "I'm speaking as a Gamma," he said, "who has served this king for 11 years, who watched him spend 3 years after his father died becoming only the role, because there was nothing outside it that he trusted enough to let in." He paused again. "He built the herb garden 4 years ago. It was the first thing he did for no reason except that he wanted it." I set down the measuring spoon. "He let you see it," Cade said simply. "He doesn't show people that." The still room was very quiet. Outside, the wind moved against the stone walls with the low sound of something patient and persistent. "What are you asking me?" I said. "Nothing," Cade said. "I'm telling you something. What you do with it is yours entirely." He rose from the stool and moved toward the door, then paused with his hand on the frame. "He went back to the herb garden that night. After you went inside. He stayed out there for a long time. He left, I stood in the still room with chamomile on my fingers, and the weight of that image settling over everything. A king standing alone in a frozen garden in the dark, staying longer than was sensible, in a place that was true. The night before Aldrich's departure, I could not sleep. I lay in the small room I had been given off the east corridor. Stone walls, a good fire, a window that looked over the inner courtyard, and listened to the castle settle around me with its old sounds. The distant footsteps of the night guard, the creak of timber against cold, the wind finding the gaps in the window frame and making itself known. I thought about Ashford, the pewter sky, the clay pots getting wet, a man on the ground by a well, who called himself a servant of no consequence, and watched my hands instead of my face while I worked. I thought about what it meant that I had stopped thinking of going home. The realization arrived without drama, the way true things often do. Not as a revelation, but as a recognition. Like finally seeing the shape of something that had been there the whole time. I was not in this castle because of a summons. I was in this castle because some part of me, kneeling in the mud of a market square, had recognized something in a man who was trying very hard to be seen clearly, and had responded to it with complete honesty, and had not stopped responding that way since. The fire burned low. I watched it until it was only coals. Tomorrow, Aldrich would ask for his answer, and the council would present its reasoning, and political necessity would arrange itself in the room like furniture, and Darius would sit at the center of it with that careful, unreadable expression and give nothing away. And I would be in the still room measuring chamomile, because that was what I was here to do. But I knew, in the way you know things that happen in the quiet before dawn, that something was coming that could not be managed with measurement or precision or careful distance. The coals glowed. Outside, the wind moved against the old stones. I pulled the blanket tighter and told myself to sleep. I didn't sleep for a long time. Aldrich made his formal request at mid-morning. I was not in the room. I knew it was happening because the castle changed in the particular way it changed when something important was being decided. A quietness in the corridors, a purposefulness in the movement of attendants, the sense of air being held. I stayed in the still room and worked. I reorganized the winter herb stores, which did not need reorganizing. I checked on the fever compound, which was fine. I found 3 small tasks that did not exist before I invented them, and completed them with excessive care. And then I sat on the stool by the window and looked at the inner courtyard, and admitted to myself that I was waiting. Petra came at midday. She came in the direct way she did everything, closed the still room door behind her, and stood for a moment with the expression of someone carrying information they are uncertain how to deliver. "He declined," she said. I looked at her. Lord Aldrich's formal request. The king declined the arrangement. She paused. Politely, with full acknowledgement of the political value and genuine respect for Lady Seraphine, but declined. The still room was very quiet. "Seraphine?" I asked. "She leaves tomorrow with her father." Petra's voice was careful. "She came to see me this morning before the meeting. She said..." Another pause. "She said she had known for some time that the king's attention was not available for an arrangement, and that she had begun to find that a relief rather than a disappointment." Something moved through Petra's expression. I think she was telling the truth. I think she came here in obligation to her father, and found that the obstacle to what he wanted was also the obstacle to something she hadn't admitted not wanting. I thought about Seraphine's face at dinner, the weariness beneath the composure, the look across the table that had been less a warning, and more perhaps a kind of recognition between 2 people who were both watching. "I hope she finds what she actually wants," I said. "So do I," Petra said. Then quietly, "Lottie, the king has asked to see you, in the garden." The midday light in winter had a particular quality at Thornwall, thin and silver and honest, the kind of light that showed everything as it was without the softening of morning gold or evening warmth. I crossed the inner courtyard in it and felt it on my face, and tried to arrange what I was feeling into something that could be carried without spilling. Darius was at the far end of the herb garden, crouched beside the raised bed where the rosemary grew, pressing his fingers into the mulched soil with the attention of someone reading something. He looked up when I came through the garden entrance, not startled, because he had heard me coming, but with the expression I had come to know best on him, open, in the way that a face is open when it has decided to stop performing. He straightened. We stood on opposite sides of the rosemary bed in the thin winter light and looked at each other, and the distance between us felt both very small and very complicated. "You heard," he said. "Petra told me." He nodded. He looked at the rosemary for a moment, then back at me with the directness that had been there from the beginning, from the market square, from the study with its maps and parchment, from every corridor exchange and garden conversation since. "The council is not pleased," he said. "Aldrich is not pleased. There will be consequences to manage. Diplomatic correspondence, border arrangements that will need to be renegotiated through different channels." A pause. "I want you to know I made that decision clearly, without confusion about what it cost." "Why are you telling me?" I asked. "Because you deserve to know that it was not made carelessly," he said. "And because it was made, in some part, with the understanding of something I have been trying to find the right words for, since a woman I had never met knelt in the mud of a market square and told me that a swollen ankle was a swollen ankle, regardless of the character of the person attached to it." The wind moved through the garden, cold and steady, lifting the edge of my cloak. "I did not bring you here to feel something for you," he said. "I brought you here because you were honest when honesty was not required, and competent when competence was not expected, and because you looked at me when you thought I was no one of consequence, exactly as you look at me now." I held very still. "I don't know the protocols for this," I said carefully. "I don't know the language of courts or alliances or what the appropriate distance is between a king and a village healer's daughter." "Neither do I," he said. "I know the protocols for everything else. I have managed kingdoms and negotiations and the particular difficulties of 11 years of governance. I do not know the protocol for this." He gestured slightly, which for Darius, who was not a man of unnecessary gesture, carried enormous weight. "You..." Something opened in my chest, wide and almost frightening. "I'm not going to be different," I said. "I will always tell Theron his injuries need tending, and argue with Oswin about the forge and say what I think when I think it is true. I don't know how to perform a different version of myself." "I know," he said. "That is precisely the difficulty, and precisely the point." We looked at each other across the rosemary in the winter light. I thought about 8 weeks of corridors and still rooms and this garden in the dark and the cold. I thought about a man in a plain gray cloak calling himself a servant and offering that version of himself to see what I would do with it. I thought about what it meant that the truest conversations I had ever had with anyone had happened in a frozen garden at night. "Ask me again," I said quietly. He looked at me. "What?" "In the garden, weeks ago. I said ask me in spring when the comfrey comes back. About practicality and romance." I met his eyes. "Ask me now instead." A silence. Something shifted in his face. Not the brief, controlled flicker I had learned to watch for, but a full shift, deep and unhurried, like a door opening all the way. "Lottie," he said, and the way he said it, not lady, not the healer, just the name I had offered him in a market square as something sufficient, made everything in me go very still and very clear. "Will you stay? Not as castle healer. Not as staff. As someone I trust with the parts of this life that have no protocol and no easy name." I breathed. Outside the garden walls, the castle carried on, Cade managing correspondence, Theron drilling the unit in the inner yard, Oswin almost certainly trying to return to the forge against explicit instruction, the old stones holding the cold and the history and the weight of everything a place accumulates over centuries. And here, in a small garden in winter light, with rosemary alive under its mulch and comfrey waiting underground for a season that had not yet arrived, a king asking a question that had no political value and every human one. Yes, I said. Simple, sufficient, true. He crossed the rosemary bed, stepped over it with the directness of a man done with distances. And when he stood before me, he raised his hand and tucked a loose strand of hair from my face with a gentleness so careful it felt like a held breath. Then his forehead came down to rest against mine, and we stood like that in the cold winter light, foreheads together, both of us breathing, and it was the quietest and most complete moment I had ever lived inside. I should tell you, he said, very quietly, that I am a difficult man. I work too much, and I find it easier to tend a garden than to speak plainly about anything that matters. And I have spent 11 years building walls. I am only just beginning to understand how to open. I know, I said. I've been watching you for 8 weeks. And I stayed, I said. Spring came late to Thornwall that year, but it came. The comfrey came back first, which I took as confirmation of something I had already decided. Then the sage, then the thyme, then the rosemary putting out new growth along stems that had looked dead through all of February and most of March. Oswin recovered full use of his arm by midwinter, and celebrated by injuring himself again in an entirely different way in early spring, which he presented to me with such genuine sheepishness that I found it impossible to be stern. Theron continued to come promptly, which was more than I had expected and exactly what I had asked for. Petra was promoted to First Gamma that spring, the first woman to hold the title in Thornwall's recorded history, and she received the news with the composure of someone who had considered it inevitable and was simply pleased to have the formality done. Cade said nothing about any of it, in the particular way of a man who had known how things would turn out and was privately satisfied. I sent word to my mother in Ashford that I would not be returning, and a writer delivered her response within the week. A short letter, in her increasingly unsteady hand, that said simply, I know. Be well. Be brave. Send herbs when the garden grows. I held the letter for a long time in the still room, and let myself miss her fiercely, and then set it on the shelf beside the dried lavender and went back to work. The formal announcement came on the first clear day of true spring, not a grand proclamation, because Darius was not a man who reached for grandeur when plainness would serve. A gathering of the castle household in the inner courtyard, the household standing in the thin, warm sun, Cade to one side with an expression of careful neutrality that fooled no one who knew him. Darius stood before his people with his house colors and his careful posture and the garden green behind him and said, in the quiet voice that carried further than it should, the woman who will stand beside me as queen of this house is Lottie of Ashford. She came here as a healer and she remains one. She will not be otherwise. I ask your respect for her on those terms, which are the only terms she has ever offered and the truest ones I know. There was a silence, the kind that breathes before it decides what to become. Then Oswin, from somewhere to my left, let out a sound that was half laugh and entirely genuine, and the silence resolved into something warm and real. And Theron nodded once with his heavy, deliberate nod, and Petra was smiling with her whole face in the way she almost never allowed herself in public. I stood in the spring sun in my Ashford dress, the good blue wool, my dress, the one my mother had made, and felt the ground under my feet as something I had chosen rather than something I had stumbled onto, and found that the difference between those two things was everything. Darius turned to me. In front of his whole household, with no crowd or ceremony between us, he offered his hand, open, plain, asking. I took it. Not because I had been brought here or summoned or elevated or rescued, but because I had knelt in the mud of a market square and seen a man trying to be seen clearly, and I had chosen to see him, and he had spent 8 weeks in a frozen winter proving that the choice had gone both ways from the very first moment. The comfrey was growing. The rosemary had survived. The garden was exactly what it had always been. True, unhurried, asking nothing but honest tending. I had learned, somewhere between Ashford and this courtyard, that I was built of the same qualities. And I had learned, in a frozen garden in the dark, that so was he. That was enough. That was, in fact, everything.